Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Koch. I'm the Managing Director for UrbanX, the accelerator for startups reimagining city life, built by Mini and Urban Us. And I'm thrilled to have three of the smartest investors in climate tech with me today for this South by Southwest audience to talk about the future of climate innovation. I'm going to start with you, Amy. Maybe you can introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about the thesis behind Buoyant Ventures, and maybe just share how you got started in the climate tech space.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be part of this program and to participate in South by Southwest. We are a new fund and we are investing in digital climate solutions. And that is primarily software that helps both with climate change mitigation as well as adaptation. And we have a very broad industry segment that we work across. We work across energy, transportation, ag and water, and the built environment. And we're especially excited about climate risk intelligence. And so that is using data to drive some kind of carbon reductions or some adaptation opportunities. So I came to the climate and clean energy space after spending years in the high-tech industry. And after, having a health scare and then having my kids, I actually decided I wanted to spend the rest of my career working on solutions for the environment because it is so deeply meaningful to me. It was a part of what has kept me healthy and sane my whole life. I'm a runner, and it was a big part of my recovery from my health scare. So I just wanted to make sure that I did everything I could with the rest of my career to find solutions to climate change so that I could leave the world in a better place for my kids and their kids.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. Danielle, thrilled to have you here. Can you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about the thesis behind Closed Loop, and also share your journey?
Yeah, and thanks so much, Micah, for having us. And I'm thrilled to be on this panel with Amy and David as well. Everyone here I respect tremendously, so it's great to be here. Closed Loop Partners is an investment firm and an innovation center focused on the circular economy. We're backed by a network of Fortune 500 corporate investors, industry experts, and impact partners. And the platform broadly spans the arc of capital from venture capital through private equity. We have a growth equity fund, an infrastructure fund, as well as an advisory services business. By way of background, I lead the venture capital platform, which is what I'm representing here on the panel today. And for us, circular economy means reducing waste in supply chains, and that hits climate in a number of different ways. It also means transforming waste feedstocks into higher value products and services. We focus on core industries of plastics and packaging, food and agriculture, fashion, as well as supply chain logistics and optimization technologies. My background is I came into this space largely from the financial side. I got kind of obsessed with how financial markets could be leveraged to create the types of changes that we needed to see from the climate perspective. And so have worked across private equity, project finance, and now venture capital in helping to transform these industries.
Awesome. We're going to come back to that and unpack some of that journey and what's on the horizon. David, I'm going to turn it over to you. We've known each other for, I think, a little bit more than 10 years now, but maybe you can introduce yourself, talk a little bit about 3x5 and share your journey.
So it's good to see my old friend, Micah Koch, and thank you South by Southwest for having us. Let me tell you a little bit about 3x5. 3x5 is a $400 million venture capital firm. We invest in what the world needs, and that includes climate solutions for we think some of the most intractable and necessary solutions in the planet, whether that be clean drinking water, clean energy. We are a top quartile firm in performance, but we're even more proud of our impact. We like to think we are top decile in impact. We were established in 2011, so before impact investing or climate solutions were cool. A little bit about myself. I don't think I've ever been cool, but I've been doing probably environmental investing, impact investing since 1995. My journey started as an intern for the former president of Sierra Club doing ancient forest protection. This was 1995. I had shoulder length hair. And together we helped protect about 45,000 acres of old growth redwood forests. So I asked Brock, who was my boss and my lifelong mentor, what should I do? Should I become an environmental lobbyist like you and fight the good fight? He gave me the best advice of my life. He said, you should go to Wall Street and leverage the engine of commerce and marry it with conservation to both build great businesses and protect the planet. So that was about 25 years from now ago. So here we are.
Thanks, David. Awesome journey. And you've also spent some time in the Obama White House, and we're going to come back to that when we talk a little bit about the new federal policy landscape. I want to start with a report that PwC issued late last year that came out with some data that suggested that investments in climate tech, and we can talk a little bit about how we define climate tech, but essentially clean tech, what used to be known as clean tech, has grown at 5 times the rate of the overall VC market over the last 7 years. And it really does feel like the world is awash in private sector capital, and I think increasingly in public sector capital around climate. So as we've seen the number of investments grow, the amount of capital deployed to new teams, even amongst COVID over the last year or so, what do you think is driving that change? What factors are at play, and can it last? And maybe David, I'll start with you.
So I think 2 main things have happened. So when I first started doing kind of climate environmental investing, we literally had to kind of hide in the back corners of offices and bars and talk about this, because if we talk to our mainstream private equity bosses about this, we would be at best laughed at, and realistically put on the wrong track in our careers. But a lot has changed in the last 25 years. First, there's been, I believe now in the last few years, there's been a global consensus that climate change is real, is an existential threat. We've seen half of Australia burning. Storms this century are now seen to be semi-annual events. And then the second thing I really would like to kind of highlight is that economics. When I first entered this sector, clean energy was seen as a luxury, subsidized, and not economic. Clean energy now is by far the most economical way to provide energy in this planet. It's cheaper than fossil fuels, more dependable, and easier to build. And this is the second thing I would also like to kind of add to that is one of the big questions, like, where are the exits? We all of us work in private equity. We are judged both by our returns and our impact. And then until recently, we have not had game-changing returns. And I think Tesla is an example where Tesla itself is worth more than all its competitors combined. And I'm a little bit sad to say that gets the attention of mainstream capital markets.
Amy or Danielle, you want to add anything onto that idea of exits and the falling cost of renewables and the perception, at least in the popular conscious of climate?
I can go, or Danielle, if you want to go.
Sure, thanks. I'll jump in. Amy, you'll take the next one. I think I'll just underline David's points and add a little bit more color, because I think both are really important. On the economic side, I think we're seeing that across the board, not just in clean energy, but also in kind of waste reduction strategies. It's becoming the obvious solution, no longer something that is a kind of question around whether or not we invest in this, but something that becomes necessary for businesses to function. The World Economic Forum recently came out and said there's $700 billion of savings available annually in net material costs for the consumer goods sector alone. So that's looking at inefficiencies in supply chains. That's been highlighted, I think, in 2020, especially with COVID, where you've been looking at these kind of just-in-time supply chains, long, complex global supply chains, where different folks in different countries are producing different goods. And when something happens, whether it's a tsunami or a flood or a global pandemic, you see those supply chains break. and having the resiliency of whether it's kind of on-site local clean energy that's providing your electricity, or you're relying on maybe a local recycled content to feed your supply chain, that creates resiliency, which I think is overwhelmingly something that we're seeing corporations and industries more broadly adopt. The other thing that I'll highlight, David mentioned, there's kind of this broad consensus around climate change. I'll highlight that that's translating not just into kind of policy implications, but also into consumer demand, which is pushing industries across the board to adopt more climate-friendly practices, both in the kind of manufacturing of their goods and also being able to tell a compelling and true narrative to their customers about what they're buying, where their products are coming from. And I think we can get into this more, but it's one of the reasons why I think we're seeing this shift happen now, where the kind of climate conversation overlapped with the circular economy conversation is now in the hands of consumers, whether it's the fashion that we're buying, whether it's the consumer products that we're buying. Energy is more intangible, so it's sometimes hard. That was one of the reasons why it was a little slower to gain traction, even though today it's certainly in the mainstream. I think it's one of the reasons why concepts like the circular economy have really taken off over the last 3 years alone. And so I think all of that is driving towards this. The other things that I'll add onto those two factors of economics and kind of general consensus is just the amount of money that's now being focused on this sector. And that's partly driven by, I think, the generational wealth transfer of folks who are now managing money or who now have access to capital, are concerned about aligning their capital with their values, in addition to the kind of low interest rate environment, which I don't know if we want to get into, but is driving certainly a lot more capital into these types of assets as well.
Amy?
I think that Danielle and David covered it all. Those are all my talking points about why. I think that they covered it very, very well. And I think that one thing I would reflect on is, I've been in the industry not as long as David, but for 16 years. And it is exciting to see that we have this coalescing of business leadership on these issues, which is making investments in climate technologies and alignment around climate risk being disclosed, and also investments that are more aligned with what's happening in the climate, and looking for carbon reductions, as well as looking for investments that are more resilient in the, in communities and in infrastructure. All these things are happening for business reasons more than they were happening probably for environmental reasons.
Right.
That leadership over the last 4 years during a political administration that was not supportive is what really, I think, helped to get us to this stage. Is like the businesses really stepped up, the investors stepped up, the corporations stepped up. They started to make these changes because it made good business sense and because they could see the global movement. And so now that we have the Biden administration who's taking a very progressive stance on climate change, we have this tremendous wind at our back. So I would like to say to your question, like, are we going to go backwards? I don't think it's going to be profitable to go backwards. I can't imagine any kind of investments in polluting industries that will be more profitable than the kinds of investments that we're seeing now. And I can't imagine corporations deciding that after they've made commitments to, carbon reductions and sustainability, to them suddenly say we don't care about that anymore. I think it really has grown up. Well, they as a corporation are leading. It's really grown up from their customers, from their employees, and I think that, and their shareholders. And I don't think that's going backwards. So that's what gives me, like, having been in the business now for this amount of time, I really feel like it is a big leap forward, because we have that wonderful alignment of positive economics and, finally in the US, at least, political leadership. But, the fundamentals of climate investing are much, much stronger than they ever were.
Agreed. It absolutely feels like a watershed moment, and kind of like a tipping point for all those reasons, from a consumer perspective, from an enterprise perspective, from a policy and supply chain perspective. It's funny. Richard Kaufman, who was the New York Energy czar, who I worked for a little while, and I know who David worked with at the Department of Energy, used to say that people will do the right things for the wrong reasons. And I want to kind of come back to that notion of, particularly on the corporate side, how large institutions are starting to change their mandates around climate, again, for a number of different reasons. So BlackRock, I think, is a really great place to start because they're the world's largest asset manager. Last month in January of 2021, they had $8.67 trillion of assets under management, the world's largest asset manager. Hard to fathom. But Larry Fink, who's the BlackRock CEO, wrote a letter recently to CEOs where he said, quote, "Climate risk is investment risk." And he warned that no issue ranks higher than climate change on our clients' list of priorities. So as a number of companies are emerging in the startup landscape that I think are trying to harness climate data and using things like financial data and physical asset data to measure and manage all these different impacts of climate change, a risk of extreme weather, a risk of floods and things of that nature. I'm curious, Amy, where do you see opportunities for this climate risk intelligence sector to both assess physical risk, and where do you think that there's new opportunities for value creation?
This is an area that we started researching last year because we were considering an investment in the category in the climate analytics space. And we were blown away by the number of young companies that were starting up to serve up data solutions to different customers. And the opportunity, I think, so sort of stepping back, one of from a venture perspective, one of the reasons we're so excited about this climate risk intelligence category is that it affects all segments of industry. And so it is not limited to a particular industry like energy, or, the built environment. It really affects all elements like the financial industry, the agriculture industry, the consumer packaged goods industry, the insurance industry. So there's a wide spectrum of customers. And it's part of the reason why we think a software solution in this category that can serve such a wide assortment of customers can become $1 billion business. And so we see growth potential because of the wide potential adoption of these solutions. We are excited about the carbon accounting space. So companies that can make it, first of all, help companies measure their emissions so that they have a baseline for making commitments to reduce, then make recommendations for how they go about making those reductions. And then the next step, which was what we've heard from customers repeatedly, is trying to quantify the return on those investments into financial data, into financial elements. So if you're making an investment to reduce your emissions, or you're also making an investment to fortify a physical asset, a lot of these property owners and businesses want to understand what am I going to get back for that. So there's a lot of potential to work with these businesses to really change and quantify climate risk into financial risk, but also to do some really broad scale carbon accounting and then make recommendations for how these businesses can reduce. And that, we think, is going to be a very, very big business. It does take quite a bit of specialization around understanding the customer's business. And so oftentimes these companies have a software component to their business, which is high margin and automates some more tedious aspects of accounting carbon emissions. But then that's usually married with some element of services, because to customize that to recommendations specific to that industry or that business, you have to get really deep into understanding that customer's business. But the good thing is that within a segment, call it automotive, chemicals, oil and gas, there are a lot of similarities between businesses. So as these companies go after different segments, they can actually go after, deeply understanding one customer's problems, but they can translate the benefits to a wide assortment of their competitors and really help a whole segment of the industry advance. And I think that that's one of the areas we're really excited about.
Yeah, agreed. We are also super excited about this. We just did a deal in a company called Singularity Energy, which is a spin out out of Harvard, and they're essentially building a very comprehensive, granular, real-time grid emission tool so that you actually have data. And I think if you play that out, then you start getting into kind of real-time carbon tracking and reporting, and ultimately management of things like distributed energy resources. And I think that the problem that they've kind of started with is the idea that most of the very commonly used grid emission factors tend to be like 2 to 3 years old, and they have no spatial or temporal granularity. So it's very difficult to manage what you cannot measure.
Yeah.
So making those things actionable, I think, enables for this really interesting transactive grid market that a lot of folks have spent a lot of time talking
Yeah.
about, but we've yet to fully realize.
One thing just to throw in there that, another advancement that is also helping this whole climate risk intelligence space is the improvements in satellite data and resolution. So that is empowering a lot of companies to use satellite imagery to make some of these assessments. And it's really gotten so much better. Like, honestly, month after month, as more and more satellites are getting launched. But, we're talking to companies now that are able to, use data at the global level that they weren't able to use before to make some of these measurements and visualizations and assessments. And so that's part of what is empowering a lot of new startups in the category as well.
Yeah, thank you. Danielle, I want to come back to BlackRock for just a minute. So last fall, the company announced a $900 million fund dedicated to circular economy ventures. And I'm curious, from your perspective, if this means that circular economy has jumped the shark or gone mainstream. And also curious to know, like, how do you think about founders using debt or equity capital as they look to build their business in this space?
Yeah, I think two really good questions. I want to just touch on your prior question for a second, because I get very excited about all the data that's available in this space around risk also. I think exactly as Amy said, there's so much more data available. Not only can we use satellites now, but we can also get granular to like your block and your zip code, what your rainfall was like, and then create better insurance products, better risk management products around specifically what's happening in your neighborhood, which is hugely impactful for the climate space. So I think there's so much happening there that's very, very exciting. Back to BlackRock. This is, I think this is a great announcement. I think it's a great indication of some of the excitement that's going on in this space, of some of the opportunity that exists here to have such a large asset manager dedicating this kind of capital into the circular economy. I think one thing that's probably worth noting here is that, and I think it's related to some of the other topics that we've been mentioning, climate-related technologies was once considered a niche industry, right? When we were out raising in years ago, folks were saying, okay, well, how are you going to find opportunities in climate tech, right? It's such a small industry. I think what everyone is realizing now, and I think this is evidenced kind of by BlackRock, is that climate circular economy touches every supply chain, every industry, right? This is a broadly applicable theme. And there is a tremendous amount of opportunity across the board in it. As we were just talking about, this touches insurance, it touches assets, it touches consumer products, right? It touches everything. So I think this is a great sign of that momentum. BlackRock is one of a few companies that have recently a few venture funds that have recently come out with these kind of circular economy mandates, or at least incorporating it into their existing strategy. And again, I think it's great for the industry. I wouldn't say that we're mainstream yet. It's still small dollars relative to the rest of the industry, even just looking at, kind of relative to the energy industry and the amount of attention that's being focused there. So I think it's a really great step in the right direction. What I would say is also existing in concert with the kind of increased capital that's available now are also more founders who are starting companies in this space, right? There's more demand. And so I think there's certainly more room for capital, especially in that kind of second tier of venture, that second stage of growth for companies, right? There's availability in that seed stage space There's capital available for kind of later financing rounds as companies are really growing well, but there's still some capital gaps along the way, especially if a company is looking to build out a project. And that relates to your second question there: how do companies think about debt versus equity? I think kind of all of us on this call have probably a good sensibility around this. Venture capital is not the right solution for every company that's out in the market. It's specifically designed for companies that are going to scale relatively quickly in that kind of, in a relatively short time frame, and that don't necessarily have a lot of heavy assets on their balance sheets, and can replicate sales pretty quickly. Debt is really appropriate in cases where you either have an asset or some kind of predictable cash flows that you might be able to get some lower cost of capital to help finance those operations. This is something that we talk with our founders a lot about. Obviously, as a more traditional venture fund, we are investing equity. We do expect our companies to kind of raise future rounds, but we try to work with them to find the right capital structure that's going to fit their business. And we have some companies in our portfolio that have taken advantage of debt or of some project equity. And there are lots of different structures that are out on the markets now that might be a better fit than the traditional venture financing methods. And David, I know your strategy is kind of built around some flexibility as well.
Yes. For us, 3x5 Partners, we are life cycle funders for our startups and climate solutions. We invest from Series A to the exit. I think one of the fundamental things I've learned both as an entrepreneur and as a VC, one of the most value destroying things an entrepreneur can do is spend a year raising money. That time should be focused on hiring talent, building business, getting to know customers. And one of the things we try to do is be that flexible, dependable, long-term capital sources that allows them to focus on building their business. But going to Micah's question, I think debt and equity are all proper tools for growing innovative companies. But it's just but debt is an issue, I think, that touches something that's very close and near and dear to my heart, which is infrastructure. I think the one thing that we don't really talk a lot about in the world of innovation is the importance of sustainable infrastructure. So this is after your next generation solar panels been built, your game-changing wind turbines designed. After it gets off the computer, off the lab bench, it actually has to go into the real world. And I only feel that you can really make true impact in climate is when you have a million panels sitting in the desert, thousands of wind turbines sitting in West Texas. And the way you finance this is not through venture capital, it's actually through sustainable infrastructure, which is project finance, which in this world is typically 20% equity and 80% debt. But that's a conversation for another panel.
Well, let's stay with that though for a minute, right? Because the panel is like, what's the future of climate innovation? So given that there are models out there that work for project finance, and given that there are new sources of capital, both from existing players and new entrants for project finance, David, like, do you think that there's room for innovation on project finance, or is it just about bringing it more to bear? And is it also about like having clarity and transparency and certainty around price signals from the administration? And also, like, what is the administration's role, given that you were a senior advisor for infrastructure at DOE?
So that's a pretty broad question. But let me table the White House question to the very end, but talk about the need for having multiple sources of capital, both. And so I think one of the key things I think it's important to be a successful investor in climate tech is to be a systems thinker. Investing in climate solutions is a team sport. And if you look at the history of many important climate solutions, they've received all sorts of capital. They've received philanthropic / government grant capital to get started, innovation or risk capital from venture capitalists. And then as they scale, they can start taking debt. And if they start building projects, they start getting project finance. And then when they kind of finally graduate, they can IPO or SPAC and have access to the multi-trillion-dollar capital markets. And all these tools need to be brought to bear as you're planning the path of your successful company. But each of these tools are appropriate for a certain stage. And most of the people here in this panel, we focus on the innovation stage, the venture capital stage. So I believe there's always room for innovation. And you see a lot of very innovative models coming around for lack of a word, distributed infrastructure or next generation infrastructure. I have friends at great places like Golden Set, Generate, Spring Lane that are pioneering these areas. And I think for us to bring more climate solutions to bear, we need more companies like them to, for lack of a better word, to finance the first few projects. So mainstream players who are probably have more mainstream mandates can wait till the first few, for lack of a word, early projects are proven out, and then they can bring in their hundreds of millions of, if not billions of dollars to bear to scale.
Yeah. And maybe I'll jump in on that for a second, because I think there's also still a gap between like actually just getting your first project up and running, especially if it's a new technology. And one of the really interesting things that we've been seeing in the space is the idea of blended pools of finance. So taking in some philanthropic dollars, layered on top of maybe more institutional capital that can, where the philanthropic dollars might provide some kind of first loss capital, which would allow some of these very innovative infrastructure projects to get off the ground, which is something that I think I would love to see more of, because it's definitely a challenge that we see in the market.
Yeah, and I think it would be great to jump in on, I liked, David, you're sort of laying out the different types of capital at different stages. And I think what we're seeing now in the public markets is honestly was a little hard to predict for all of us in the space, that we haven't seen that kind of public outcome for a lot of these businesses, and has really grown in the last year, but I think is also really exciting because it is providing much needed super growth capital for these businesses. And I think it's going to be especially good for the venture community, because a lot of these businesses that maybe otherwise were looking for straight M&A are now able to go public, and they're seeing demand, both from institutional investors as well as retail investors in the public markets. And I think that's a really exciting opportunity. And I know there's a lot of folks are wondering if we're in a bubble and if the SPACs are going to, be able to maintain momentum. But I think, there's certainly good companies that are going public, and then ones that are not so good or not as strong for the public market. So I think getting that match of the right type of capital into the right type of business is still really, really important there. But it's definitely providing liquidity for investors and founders, and will empower those companies that make it out and have a healthy IPO to also acquire these other small high growth businesses. So it's really helping to provide, a full, complete result for a lot of the early stage funding that we're doing, which is, to me, really exciting. We just haven't had the luxury of that for years and years, not since I've been investing in the space. So I think we're super excited about what's happening in the public markets.
Yeah, agreed. I want to stay with that for a second. There's a great piece in Forbes that Rob Day from Spring Lane Capital wrote about these special purpose acquisition companies, these SPACs, and essentially them, being this alternate exit route where there has not been traditionally a huge amount of M&A in climate tech from a lot of very, very slow moving incumbents. And I think now we've seen about 40 climate tech SPACs that have been announced over the last year or so. 10 of them have de-SPACed, and they've posted something like 138% return versus a 59% return for the overall SPAC market. So certainly anything tied to EVs, but increasingly in sustainability and climate, I think is really hot and very, very well received. And that's kind of fed this loop, right? Where investors are reading, the regulatory tea leaves, and the issuers, the big banks are certainly leveraging the moment. But I'm curious, maybe Danielle or David, if you want to give us your perspective here, are they maybe an over leveraged tool of financial engineering, or do you think that there are really legitimate exit route that's ultimately going to challenge incumbents in this space and help to bend the emissions curve, and also, as Amy said, maybe spur a new wave of M&A for earlier stage companies?
So I think one of the things I learned at the Obama White House is to kind of ask your question, what side of history are you on? And I think we can now all acknowledge, as well as Wall Street is expressing through their actions, that people believe that climate change is real and the transition to a low carbon, zero carbon economy is the future. There's no longer the debate, is this the right thing to do? Can we make money? This is the way the world's going. And I think the question is, how quickly do we progress in this direction? I think SPACs are a natural reaction from the capital market that are chasing growth. And they know the industries that are growing are clean and low carbon and sustainable. If you look, I love, one of the best things I've seen Bloomberg in a while is that the clean energy majors, so a lot of the European, clean energy companies, they have bigger market caps than the fossil fuel companies, whether that being Exxon or Shell. And that kind of shows where the future is going, and the SPACs are a manifestation of this transition.
Danielle?
Yeah, I would agree with what David just said there. I think it's overwhelmingly, I think it's a useful tool for sure, and I don't think it's going to go away. And I think it will continue to be a useful tool for companies that are looking for that type of liquidity, and also for participation in the public markets. I think what we're seeing, this kind of this momentum, is certainly being underwritten by growth opportunities, and I think that's really exciting. I think one of the challenges that we're constantly weighing is that the equity markets kind of broadly look a little overinflated. It's not just the SPAC market, and so I think at the end of the day, for each company, it's really a question of what's the right decision for that company. Is it the right decision to take advantage of these markets, of the kind of capital availability? Will this be the last capital raise that those companies might need? Or does it make more sense for those companies to wait a little bit longer? And that's the kind of individual decision for the CEOs and the shareholders.
Are you seeing like the insanity trickle down to the early stage from a valuation perspective?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, we definitely are. I'm sure that we would all agree on that. I mean, just like, in the last 6 months even, and so many companies that maybe did a funding round last year don't really need the capital, but are back out raising now just because the market is so good. So I think that there is, the valuations are absolutely creeping up. Everybody's raising, trying to take advantage of this strength in the market. And I think as investors, we still have to be disciplined around valuations, because, you're holding these investments for a long time, right? We're in these companies for, as venture investors, 3, 5, 7 years. So it's very important that the companies don't set themselves up for a future down round by being a little too greedy right now. So I think that that's a real consideration. But, the other thing that's happening in the space is the entry of a lot of general tech investors. And, for all of us, I'm sure that Danielle and David find this as well, that we're going into more deals where we are investing alongside a larger, say, general tech fund. And we're trying to, find our way into those deals because we have this sector expertise. And that's certainly our case when we're looking at these climate tech deals, because for the most part, these are companies that are fintech companies, software companies. And so they attract, once they get to a certain, scale and health, they start to attract capital from, bigger funds that have typically invested in those segments. So, still want to make sure that it's not getting silly or out of hand, because you have to underwrite this for a venture return. And if we are inflating valuations to a point that is unsustainable in the company's growth, we will not be able to get the kind of return that we expect.
Right, right. Great point, Amy. I want to turn the conversation to COVID and job creation and environmental justice. I think one of the first things that this new administration did, and rightly so, was really make environmental justice a real priority. And I'm curious kind of how you see the connection between, what we'll broadly call climate innovation, early stage company creation, and jobs and workforce development, particularly in frontline communities. David, you want to try and
I'll take that. So we cannot successfully fight climate change and mobilize the trillions of dollars we need to mitigate and adapt to our changing environment if there is a world of climate haves and climate have-nots, or there's a world of people who believe in climate and people who refute climate. This, again, as I said, has to be a team sport. And the one thing we need to be very clear about is that we can't have the top 1% driving Teslas. We need mass adoption of EVs where everyone's driving electric vehicles. And I think another very clear thing that we've learned in this last year with Black Lives Matter is that the impacts of climate is inordinately faced by people who are poor in developing markets and who are sick. And if we don't acknowledge these truths, I feel we will not create successful holistic climate solutions. And I think one of the key things I learned at the Obama White House is that there's one word that is always bipartisan. That's jobs. And if you don't lead with jobs, it's very difficult to get, let's say, those other 10 votes you need to get things passed. And the one thing I'm very, very happy with about the Biden administration is they've hired a team of all-stars that get it. So like Brian Deese, John Kerry, Gina McCarthy, Melanie Nagawa, they get it. And that allows me to kind of sleep better at night. And I just wanted to add one last thing. So this is something I've always been very sensitive. So people always ask me this question. So what do you think about the Trump White House and its impact on climate investing, or the Biden White House impact on climate investing? And that there's always this undercurrent that climate tech needs government support or subsidies to be an attractive investment. That is flat out wrong. The most interesting, compelling opportunities in clean energy, mobility are based in sustainability. We can talk about Tesla all day long. We can talk about how the majority of new build for energy is clean energy. You can't really build a natural gas plant or a coal plant in the US anymore. And so I think those are kind of the key points I wanted.
Yeah, and I'll jump in and underline some other points there. I think maybe focusing the conversation a bit more on kind of circular economy related to jobs. I think a lot of what we think about within closed loop is, investing in local recovery systems, local processing systems. All of that is kind of inherently close to the points of consumption, and therefore creates local jobs. So we have, we are putting out our impact report soon, but you'll see kind of job creation across a lot of the infrastructure assets that we've invested in, also across the venture portfolio that we have of climate related and circular economy solutions. And I think David mentioned this. I think that you have to be a systems thinker to be a climate investor, right? And I think specifically around this topic, you have to think not just about job creation. You have to think about that kind of health impacts on the communities that you're servicing, or the health impacts of the communities that you're siting your facility next to. And how are you going to build that facility? How are you going to pay your workers a minimum wage or a living wage, right? How are you going to treat your employees? And really thinking about that entire system very holistically. What's the diversity look like on your board, on your management teams? And those are things that I think I've always been very heartened to look at in this space, and I think it's reflected in our portfolio companies as well. A lot of the CEOs, especially of our venture companies, are representative of diversity. They think about these issues around job creation, around kind of good living standards, around integrating not just their solutions and pushing those solutions out to market, but integrating those solutions with the benefits that the communities, their local communities are going to appreciate. And there's a lot of kind of good collaboration and communication that happens on all sides of the table there. And so I think it's exciting to see that happening at the level of the portfolio companies. It's exciting to be thinking about it from the level of closed loop partners as an investor in the space. But I think certainly thinking about environmental justice, again, not just from the jobs perspective, but also from, how do we support all of our communities? And I know, Micah, you and I are both heavily connected to Green City Forest, which is a great organization that is, kind of bringing lower income communities into helping train lower income communities for clean energy jobs, for these kind of regenerative agriculture jobs, for everything that kind of hits these climate issues. And I think having that collaboration between nonprofit sectors, between government, between the private sector, between investors, between insurance companies, all targeting these issues is really essential. So it's hard to see that a lot of the images that we saw in 2020, and unfortunately, I think we'll probably continue to see a lot of the kind of challenging kind of violence that we've seen historically in the country. But I think we're hopefully moving in the right direction on climate issues and environmental justice broadly.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. So Amy, I'm going to ask you to start just the last question here. I'm going to ask you about your thesis as it relates to maybe just one subcategory and maybe the because climate is so large, right? And so all encompassing. There are so many different dimensions of the opportunity, the total opportunity. What are you most excited about? And maybe is there one portfolio company that you want to share as kind of an illustrative example of why you're excited about that subcategory?
Sure. So let me talk about a deal that we did. Our first deal for Buoyant Ventures is in a solar software company called Raptor Maps. And they are a software company that is analyzing drone footage that is captured by airplanes of utility scale solar farms. And they're turning that footage into useful insights and recommendations for the owners, operators, and engineers to help optimize the solar systems. And they make recommendations for repairs. They also make recommendations for vegetation management and cleaning and other things that will help improve the output of solar power from that system. The other thing they're doing is trying to capture that into an independent record so that when there is a change of ownership or an insurance claim for that system, there is an independent sort of source of truth on what the output has been for that system. And there's really two reasons why this is important. One is it's sort of producing more solar power from the investments that we have already. So there's an additionality on the improvement of output of solar power from using their solution. But the second piece is making it easier for large scale capital, especially capital that is not traditionally experienced in the renewables industry, to come in and transact because they have a better idea of what they're buying and what kind of guarantees of performance they will have from these investments. So something like a solution like Raptor Maps, we think is sitting right at this sort of intersection on renewable power and just making it all work better and attracting more capital into the market. I wanted to maybe make a call out for a company in my prior funds portfolio that's doing quite well also, which is Aurora Solar. So staying with the solar theme, Aurora Solar makes it easy for rooftop solar installers to design and sell solar systems. So they've got an integrated platform for designing a rooftop system from someone's desktop or from their computer. And so you don't have to climb on the roof, and then they can very quickly analyze what kinds of incentives or financing are available for that customer to make it easy to sell to that customer. And we see a lot of wonderful innovation using digital technologies around solar energy at the distributed level, at the utility scale level.
Yeah.
And think with the global growth of solar power continuing the way it is, there's going to be many, many more good solutions and good companies to invest in.
Absolutely, and ways to drop soft costs as well. Very cool. David, give us a company and an example of how you're thinking about new opportunities in the coming year.
Okay, so for us, it's not really about technology, it's about entrepreneurs and teams. One of the mantras at 3x5 is relationships at the heart of our returns. And we tend to work with serial entrepreneurs that we've been successful before, and then they bring us back to do their next venture. But I think the one key thing I'd like to highlight for the audience is that when I started out in kind of impact investing and climate investing, they were said there was a dearth of quality entrepreneurs. And now I think that's the exact opposite. I feel the most talented people in the innovation ecosystem are mission driven. Their missions may be climate, it may be working with bottom of the pyramid, but there is a mission to it. And one of our most talented CEOs is a gentleman named Cody Friesen. He started a company called Source, formerly known as Zero Mass Water. They use sunlight and air to make drinking water. It's a company that is answering a really big need in our world, is that there's a lack of drinking water, potable water everywhere, whether you're thinking about India, Africa, to the United States, like places like Flint or the Navajo Nation. It's a company we're so excited because it kind of checks the three boxes in our kind of impact metrics. It is creating a new market, which is a sustainable market around having resilient distributed drinking water. It has a new business model. It's pioneering something called a water purchase agreement, where instead of buying these water producing panels, you actually buy water by the liter, which makes it much more economical. And then finally, it's a groundbreaking technology solution. Cody, in addition to being a great CEO, is also, I think, a very talented man in science, and recently won the MIT Lemelson Award for innovation. So that kind of highlights how 3x5 thinks about kind of investing in climate tech and climate solutions. Awesome. And also it's sustainable infrastructure, a personal passion of mine.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks, David. Danielle.
Yeah, I think maybe somewhat similarly, one of the companies that I would highlight as being most exciting in the portfolio today is a company called Home Biogas, which is kind of down the fairway for our thesis in that it takes organic waste, processes it on site, so next to your house in a small scale anaerobic digester, and then on the other side produces a clean cooking fuel that you could pipe into your grill in the backyard or directly into your home if you wanted, and also produces a liquid fertilizer. This is a company that we invested back in 2016 and have supported them through their subsequent rounds. That we were one of the first institutional capital providers into the company, and then participated through till today with the company. As they've grown, they have operations and are selling these units really across the world. One of the things that I think ties into our last conversation is that we have to be investing not just in the solutions that are available to kind of the elite consumers in developed markets, but also in consumers everywhere. And so these are very affordable units being sold by distributors, again, largely in kind of East Africa, India, but also in developed markets like the US and Europe as well. So very excited to see that company grow, and I think are similarly excited about other technologies that are taking waste and creating something of higher value from it in a very economic, scalable way.
Yeah, super interesting. There's so much really cool stuff out there that I think will emerge, and hopefully be in the hands of our audience over the next couple of years. So with that, I want to thank the three of you. Thank you so much for your leadership and for your time and for your candor in this conversation. And to our audience at home or wherever you might be, hopefully we'll see you next year in person at South by. Be safe, be excellent to each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Danielle, David, Micah, thank you.
Thanks
Be
so much,
well.
everyone.